right, I really want you to hear the words of St. Paul in his second letter to the Corinthians, because if there's anything we all have in common is that we don't like to suffer. And so our first reaction oftentimes in suffering is, why me? And many times we hear others who are suffering profoundly say, I'm a good person, or so-and-so whom I love who is suffering doesn't deserve this. As if God, put the wrong person in prison somehow. Look at St. Paul's response to the suffering in his life. First of all, he expresses what that suffering looks like. We hold this treasure in earthen vessels, so you know that they're broken, right? But the treasure, of course, is the gift of grace, the divine life that he has received, which takes various forms, not only in his baptism, but particularly in his priesthood. And then but it's in earthen vessels, broken vessels. Why? That the surpassing power may be of God and not from us. So it's very urgent, and this is the same guy, remember, who was worshipped by the Gentiles because they thought he was one of their pagan gods. He's recognizing it is urgent that people understand anything good in my life, it is of God, it is not of me, so that the entirety of my life leads to the glory of God. So what does that look like? We are afflicted in every way, not some ways, every way, but not constrained, because God is merciful, right? Perplexed, but not driven to despair, because God has set limits. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus. That sounds awful. So that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. For we who live are constantly being given up to death for the sake of Jesus. Again, this sounds awful. So that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. There's nowhere in this narrative that suffering has no meaning, is utterly arbitrary, is a punishment by God, a loveless act of a tyrannical creator. None of that. Not because he doesn't suffer. He's suffering more than anybody in this church right now. But he understands that even in his suffering there is mission. And that mission is to glorify God, not generically, specifically, to carry about the death of Christ in his very flesh. Why might that have value? Go back to that moment of Jesus' own suffering and death. How he died, praying for the people who nailed him to the cross, asking that his mother would receive his enemies as her sons, loving people to the end, even refusing the consolation of the diminishing of his suffering by virtue of the wine, like the alcohol meaning to sort of tone down the pain. And he's like, no, moves his head. Only calling out to the Father. That witness was precisely what changed that centurion's heart, who fell to the ground on his knees, and as a result of the passion of Christ and how he embraced it, glorified the name of God and repented of his sins. And because that centurion has an infinite soul, Christ would have done all of that for him alone, if he was the only one that would be converted by this suffering. And Paul understands this. Paul benefited from it himself in his own life, which made him a persecutor of Christ into one who is persecuted for Christ. So when we sit back and complain about our sufferings, do you see what we're missing in all of this? I mean, there are saints. If you go to the shrine of Carlo Acutis up in Malvern, he has all these saints that were totally committed to the Eucharist, they're all on this wall. One of them was bedridden, a total physical vegetable for reasons I think they couldn't explain, but her mind was completely intact. And she laid in bed, I think, for like 30 years. She couldn't hold a book. There was no such thing as TV. She couldn't go anywhere. She couldn't meet new friends, have relationships, get married, have children. And she lived on the Eucharist. And her joy was deeper than anything anybody in my life even knows. And because of that, she stands as a witness that real joy comes from God, not from physical comforts. And her suffering has led to the glory of the Heavenly Father, the proclamation of his Son's name, and the salvation of souls. So next time we suffer, I want you to go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Reach out to Paul and ask him to help it make sense, knowing that all suffering has meaning.